You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice isn't sunlight or birdsong. It's the smell, damp, sore, heavy. It clings to your nose and coats the back of your throat. You're lying on a straw-stuffed pillow that scratches your cheek, wrapped in a blanket that hasn't seen soap since before you were born. Somewhere in the room, a floorboard creaks like it's sighing under the weight of yet another day. This is Victorian London, and it doesn't care if you're ready to wake up or not. The city moves on whether you crawl out of bed or stay buried in that itchy blanket. And even here, inside this cramped little room, the city seeps in, through the walls, through the air, through the cough that rattles in your neighbour's chest as he shifts in his sleep. You sit up slowly. The ceiling above you sags, stained with leaks from rains that came and went months ago. The plaster peels in long, curling strips, like the room itself is trying to shed its skin. There's no wallpaper anymore, just patches where something once covered the walls, now long gone. The air is damp, cold enough to make your joints ache, and the fire in the corner is fake, nothing but bricks painted black to give the illusion of warmth. Around you, 6 other bodies stir. Brothers, sisters, maybe a cousin, maybe someone who isn't family at all but had nowhere else to go. The room doesn't care who belongs. It just collects the desperate, piling them in together like potatoes in a sack. 1 bed, 2 chairs that wobble if you look at them wrong, and the chamber pot in the corner that everyone pretends not to notice. That's it. That's the whole inventory. You shuffle your feet onto the floor, and it answers back with a long, aching creak. The boards are warped, uneven, damp from spills no one cleaned and leaks no one could stop. Somewhere between the cracks, rats scuttle. You've heard them at night, gnawing on crumbs or squabbling over scraps of cloth. You pretend you don't mind, because in this city, rats are roommates just like everyone else. The window, if you can call it that, is little more than a grimy rectangle sealed with soot. It lets in no real light, only the sounds of the street, cartwheels rumbling, vendors already yelling, someone coughing, deep and wet, just a few doors down. When the fog is thick, and it usually is, you can't see the end of your own arm out there, but you can hear it. The city never shuts up. Even when the fog muffles everything, you hear the clatter of boots, the scream of a horse, the clang of metal. You move through the morning routine that isn't really a routine, more like a shuffle of chaos. Everyone trying to dress under blankets to ward off the chill. Everyone fighting for a turn at the wash basin. Someone always knocks over the chamber pot. Always. It splashes, it spills, someone curses, someone laughs nervously, and then everyone tries to forget about it. That's how the day begins, like a cruel joke with a little extra misery to set the tone. But this is home. You know which corner leaks, which board creaks, which pane rattles before your neighbour yells about stolen boots. You know how to angle your body at night to avoid someone else's elbow, how to breathe through your mouth in the morning to dodge the smell, how to claim the chair with the least wobble when it's time to sit. Home doesn't have to be pleasant. It just has to be familiar. You grab your coat, thin, patched, smelling of smoke, and step toward the door. Your stomach growls, already thinking about breakfast, though it knows the word breakfast doesn't mean much anymore. Bread if you're lucky, porridge if the rats left you anything, tea because it's safer than water. You don't think too hard about it. Hunger is constant, like the fog, and thinking about it just makes it worse. You push open the door, and the city greets you with a slap. The fog is so thick it feels like walking into a wet wool blanket. It seeps into your lungs, coats your tongue, and stings your eyes. This isn't the romantic mist of novels. This is London fog, the infamous pea souper, born of coal smoke and natural mist twisted together into something murderous. The air is a cocktail of chimney soot, sewage vapour, horse manure, and last night's cabbage left too long on the stove. If perfume makers bottled it, they'd call it urban misery. You cough because everyone coughs. Children hack like old men, and old men hack so hard the windows rattle. Doctors say, move to the countryside, which is great advice if you own land and lungs worth saving. For everyone else, coughing is just part of the soundtrack, right up there with church bells and horse hooves on cobblestones. Street lamps burn all day long, their weak flames swallowed by the fog. You squint at shapes that might be lamp posts or might be horses. The mist plays tricks, swallowing umbrellas whole, hiding alleys, turning every step into a guess. At night, it gets even worse. The fog curls under doors, slinks through cracks, and settles into your lungs like an unwelcome tenant. Without a candle lit, you risk walking face first into the fireplace or worse, into someone you wish you hadn't met. You tighten your coat and keep walking, because what else can you do? The city doesn't wait for you to adjust. It doesn't care that the air is poison or that your clothes are stained with soot. London keeps moving, and so do you. You pass the butcher's alley, where offcuts are dumped into the street. The smell is so strong it overpowers even the fog. A goat bleats from somewhere nearby, a neighbour's animal tethered in a place with no grass, chewing on something that probably isn't food. Vendors shout about eels and potatoes, voices sharp and desperate, cutting through the haze like knives. Everywhere, the air feels alive. Not fresh, not clean, alive in the sense that it presses against you, fills you, tries to become part of you. You taste it when you lick your lips. You feel it when you run your hand through your hair and come away with grit. You see it when you wipe your sleeve across a window pane and the cloth comes away black. The city doesn't just surround you. It marks you. And yet, despite the stench, the coughs, the constant damp, life goes on. You watch a child dart between horses to grab a fallen crust. You see a woman balancing a basket of laundry on her head, her steps steady despite the mud sucking at her boots. You hear laughter, thin and tired, but laughter all the same. The city is brutal, but it's also buzzing, restless, impossible to ignore. This is only the beginning of the day. You've barely made it out of bed, through the fog, and onto the street. Ahead lies the market, the factories, the endless grind of survival. But for now, just standing here in the thick grey haze, you can already feel it. The city pressing down on you, daring you to keep moving. London doesn't whisper. It growls. It coughs. It drags you into its rhythm whether you want to join or not. And in this part of town, in this age of coal and smoke, surviving a single morning is already an accomplishment. The city doesn't hand out comfort. It hands out tests. Every breath you take, every step you make through the muck and the fog is just another small victory. And you keep moving because that's all you can do. You breathe through it, cough through it, blink through it, and you keep going because the city won't stop for you. You'd think home would be a place of rest, a place where the world outside can't reach you. But in Victorian London, home was often the very thing that wore you down first. Picture it one single room, not a one bedroom, not a cozy studio, just one room. That was it. A space meant for one person, sometimes two, crammed full with half a dozen souls, maybe more, all trying to exist without tripping over each other's elbows, boots, or breath. You wake up wedged between bodies, your brother's foot dangling inches from your face, your sister's hair spilling across your shoulder, and the unmistakable sound of someone snoring like they're sawing wood with every exhale. Privacy isn't a word, you know. The room doesn't have corners for that. It has corners for storing buckets, broken chairs, and the occasional sack of coal, if you're lucky enough to have one. The walls are thin, cracked, streaked with damp, and they shudder when the wind pushes too hard. You can hear the neighbours through them, arguing, laughing, coughing, sometimes crying. The ceiling drips when it rains, and even when it doesn't, something still manages to fall. Some oily drip that no one has dared investigate. The floor groans under every step like it resents you for being alive. And then there's the smell. Not one smell, but layers upon layers, like the city distilled into a single room. Damp wool blankets that never fully dry, sweat from too many bodies pressed too close. The acrid tang of coal, dust sneaking in through cracks in the window frame. And always, always the chamber pot. It sits in the corner like a quiet enemy, its presence unavoidable, its contents unmentionable. Everyone does their best to ignore it, but in a room this small, ignoring only goes so far. Morning begins with chaos. The shuffle starts before you even open your eyes. 6 people twisting, stretching, stepping around each other in a ballad of desperation. There's one wash basin. Just one. And everyone wants it. The line isn't orderly. It's whoever can shove their way in fastest. Someone's elbow in your ribs, someone else's knee on your foot. The water inside grows murky after the first 2 turns, but by the time it's your turn, you use it anyway. You splash your face, wipe your hands on your trousers, and pretend you feel cleaner. Inevitably, someone bumps the chamber pot. It spills. It always spills. A quick curse, a groan, and then everyone pretends it didn't happen. What else can you do? There's no fresh water to wash it away, no bleach to scrub the floor. Just a rag, a few angry swipes, and the hope that the smell will fade before nightfall. Clothes are pulled on under blankets, because the air bites a bare skin. Layers are thin and patched. Hand-me-downs from cousins, neighbours, strangers, who can even remember anymore. A shirt that doesn't fit, trousers with knees worn through, a coat that might as well be tissue paper for all the warmth it provides. Shoes are precious. If you've got them, you guard them. If you don't, you go barefoot and let the city chew at your soles. The room doesn't just house people, it houses pests too. Rats scurry behind the walls, bold enough to dart out and snatch crumbs when no one's looking. Fleas and lice are as common as air, burrowed into bedding, crawling across collars. You scratch absent-mindedly because everyone scratches. It's as natural as breathing. And yet, somehow, this miserable little space is still home. You know its sounds, its smells, its quirks. You know exactly which board creaks near the door, which corner stays dreiced when it rains, which patch of wall feels warmest when the neighbour's stove is burning on the other side. It's not comfort, not in any real sense, but it's familiarity. And in a world where every street could swallow you whole, familiarity feels like safety. There's one window in the room, though it barely deserves the name. Its glass is so stained with soot and fog that sunlight, if it even exists outside, doesn't bother trying to come through. What it does let in is sound. Cartwheels rattling over cobblestones, vendors shouting about potatoes or eels, a neighbour yelling that his boots were stolen in the night. Sometimes you catch a whiff of roasted chestnuts drifting up from a street corner, but just as often it's the butcher's offcuts rotting in the alley below. When the air outside thickens with fog, it presses against the window until it feels like the city itself is breathing into your home. You wipe the glass with your sleeve, but it only smears the grime. The cloth comes away black, and the view doesn't improve. So you sit there staring at a rectangle of grey, listening to the endless chorus of London, and you know the city hasn't forgotten you. It won't let you forget it either. Evenings in the room are no better. Everyone crams back inside after a day of work or begging or wandering, and the air grows hot with the weight of bodies. Voices rise. Someone complains about the wash water. Someone argues over space on the bed. Someone coughs, deep and rattling, and for a moment everyone goes quiet listening, wondering if that cough will still be there tomorrow. Meals, if they can be called that, are eaten here too. A crust of bread passed around, a ladle of thin soup shared between 3 bowls, maybe a potato boiled until it falls apart, split into uneven chunks. Children chew faster than adults because hunger makes manners optional. The sound of gnawing, slurping, licking fingers. Food disappears as quickly as it arrives. And then the night settles in. The room grows darker, the air thicker. The candle burns low, its wax dripping onto the table already scarred with cuts and burns. Shadows stretch across the walls, hiding the cracks but not the smell. People lie down wherever they can. On the bed, on the floor, leaning against the wall. Sleep comes not as rest but as surrender. You don't drift off gently. You collapse into it, worn out, hoping the rats don't crawl across your legs before morning. This one-room home isn't just shelter. It's a teacher. It teaches you to endure discomfort, to share without wanting to hold your tongue when someone's elbow digs into your ribs. It prepares you for the streets outside, where space is just as scarce, where comfort is just as absent, where survival is just as relentless. By the time you walk out the door in the morning, you're already wary, already tested. The room has made sure of that. And yet there are moments, tiny, fleeting, that make it bearable. A laugh at the absurdity of everyone stumbling into each other during the morning shuffle. A quiet lullaby hummed by your mother as she rocks the baby in the corner. A story whispered in the dark by your brother about something he saw in the market. For a few minutes, the room feels less like a trap and more like a cocoon. Not comfortable, not pleasant, but shared. And in a city that grinds people into dust, sharing is its own kind of survival. So when someone asks where you live, you don't just say, room. You say, home, because the word has to mean something. Even if it's only one space, one bed, one bucket, one window. Even if it creaks and leaks and smells like despair. It's where you begin each day. It's where you drag yourself back each night. And in the brutal rhythm of Victorian London, that's enough. Your stomach growls before the light ever reaches your eyes. Not that there's much light to begin with, just a grey smear of fog pressing against the window pane. Hunger wakes you faster than any alarm, a gnawing ache that reminds you the day has already begun whether you're ready or not. Breakfast. The word feels generous here. In Victorian London, breakfast doesn't conjure images of sizzling bacon or golden toast. It's not eggs sunny side up with a sprinkle of salt, not porridge sweetened with honey and cream. For most working-class families, breakfast is simply something. Anything. A scrap, a crust, a ladle of grey liquid that keeps you moving long enough to reach work. You stumble into the morning shuffle inside the one-room home, and someone's already tearing into the loaf that was bought, or begged for, the night before. If you're lucky, there's bread left. It's hard, nearly stone by now, the kind of bread that cracks more than it crumbles. You tear off a piece with your teeth, jaw aching as you chew, and tell yourself it's filling. It isn't, but hunger makes liars of us all. Porridge is another option, if the oats survive the night. Rats are shameless and quick, and a careless lid left off the cupboard is all it takes for them to claim their share. If porridge makes it to the pot, it's boiled thin, stretched with water until it looks more like grey paste than food. No sugar, no cream, just a bowl of something warm enough to trick your stomach into believing it's satisfied. Tea is a given, not because it's comforting, not because it's part of some grand tradition, but because it's boiled. In a city where water can kill you, boiling is the cheapest shield against disease. Every home, no matter how poor, scrapes together enough leaves to brew a pot. The colour is weak, the flavour faint, but it's safe. At least safer than dipping a cup straight into the Thames or the communal pump down the street. Milk is a gamble. Vendors water it down to stretch the supply, and some go further, mixing in chalk or even formaldehyde to keep it from spoiling. Parents pour it carefully, eyes sharp for signs of soreness, noses twitching at the faintest whiff of rot. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it sends a child to bed feverish, clutching their stomach, praying it passes. Butter and jam. Luxuries. Legends. Butter is expensive, jam rarer still. A sweet dream most kids only hear about from older relatives who remember better days. For those truly down on their luck, orphans, widows, men who lost their jobs to machines. There's the workhouse. A line of the desperate stretches outside in the cold fog, waiting for a turn at a ladle of gruel. It's warm, edible, and that's about the kindest thing anyone can say about it. A bowl of gruel won't fill you, won't give you strength, but it will quiet the hunger just long enough to push you into another day. On the streets, vendors call out their wares: fried potatoes, pies that smell tempting even when the filling is suspiciously vague. Meat pies, especially, are everywhere, cheap, portable, and always a gamble. The crust hides everything: stringy beef, old mutton, sometimes scraps of who knows what. One bite could leave you satisfied, another doubled over with what locals call the gripes. Still, the smell is intoxicating when you haven't eaten since yesterday. The hiss of frying oil, the steam rising into the fog. It's enough to make your mouth water, no matter how many times it's betrayed you. Street breakfasts are eaten standing, coat pulled tight, bread clutched in one hand while the other fights off the chill. You chew quickly because the air is damp and cold, because the street is crowded, because someone's already yelling about stolen coal 2 doors down. No dining table, no leisurely meal, no moment to savor the flavor. Just a bite, a swallow, and back into the chaos. And yet, even this meager ritual becomes habit. A crust shared among siblings, a mug of thin tea warming cold fingers, the smell of potatoes frying on a street corner mixing with the acrid smoke of coal fires. Breakfast isn't joy, it isn't comfort, but it is a start. It's the line between going to work with something in your stomach and going with nothing at all. For the wealthier classes, the story is different. They dine on eggs, bacon, sausages, kippers, toast thick with butter, porridge rich with cream, and tea served in fine china. Their breakfast lasts an hour, sometimes more, taken in dining rooms where the fog is kept outside by heavy curtains. But for most of London, those meals might as well belong to another world, one that's close enough to imagine, but far enough to remain out of reach. Children know the hunger best. They wake earlier than anyone else, stomachs already groaning, eyes darting toward the cupboard with its dwindling stash of bread. Some steal bites before their parents notice. Some wait patiently for their turn, only to find the loaf gone by the time it reaches them. The smallest learn quickly: eat fast, eat first, or go without. Even in these harsh mornings, there's a strange rhythm to it all. Families huddle around the table, if they have one, or gather cross-legged on the floor, bowls balanced on knees. Someone pours the tea, someone divides the bread, someone scrapes the last of the porridge from the pot. For a few minutes, there's a sense of unity, shared hunger, shared survival, shared beginnings. Then it's over. The bowls are licked clean, the crusts tucked into pockets for later, the tea dregs tossed onto the floorboards. Everyone scatters. To the factory, the docks, the laundry house, the street. Breakfast doesn't linger. It doesn't leave you satisfied. It just marks the start of another day in a city that feeds you only because it needs you to keep moving. You step outside, half full at best, the fog already thick in your throat. Hunger isn't gone. It never is. It follows you into the streets, into the factory, into the very rhythm of your day. But at least you had something. A crust, a sip, a thin excuse for a meal. Enough to trick your body into believing it can keep going. And in Victorian London, sometimes a trick is all you need. You step out from the cramped one-room home, your belly lined with nothing more than a crust of bread and weak tea, and immediately the streets of London remind you that they don't care if you're ready. The fog greets you like a wall, thick and wet, wrapping around your shoulders and slipping down your throat. The cobblestones glisten with yesterday's rain, though you know better than to think that shine is clean. The city's streets are alive, but not in a way that welcomes you. They breathe, they pulse, they move like a beast, and every time you step outside, you're stepping straight into its open jaws. At first, the sound hits you. Wheels clatter, hooves pound, voices shout over one another. There's no rhythm, no order, just a constant barrage. Vendors hawk their goods, eels, potatoes, meat pies of questionable origin. Children call out newspapers, their voices breaking through the smog like tiny trumpets. Somewhere down the road, a man is already yelling about his stolen boots. You can't tell if he's furious or just resigned. Here, theft is part of the morning routine. The road itself is chaos. Narrow sidewalks, when they exist, are cracked, crowded, and useless. Most people spill into the street because there's nowhere else to go. Horse-drawn carts barrel past, their wheels inches from your toes, the drivers shouting curses at anyone who dares step too close. A carriage tilts dangerously on a rut, nearly toppling, before lurching forward again. You keep your head down, dodging hooves, wheels, elbows. The city doesn't stop for you. If you hesitate, you're trampled. And then there are the gutters. They run down the middle of road like open veins, carrying the city's refuse in a grimy flow. Rotting vegetables float past. Coal ash mixes with mud. Dead rats bob in the filth, their bodies spinning lazily as if the gutter is the Thames itself. Chamber pots, emptied from upper windows during the night, have joined the current, their contents spreading out into slick puddles that you do your best to leap over. It's a leap you don't always land. One misstep, and your boot sinks ankle deep into something that smells like it died twice. Crossing the street is an Olympic event. You time your steps between carts, carriages, and sprinting children. You balance on broken stones to avoid the gutter's stream. You pray the fog thins enough to spot the horse before it spots you. Even when you succeed, you emerge on the other side with your coat damp, your shoes coated, your nerves shot. The people are as dangerous as the street itself. Pickpockets brush against your coat like shadows with quick fingers. Street urchins dart around, desperate, bold, daring you to chase them. Vendors scream their wares directly into your face, their eyes wild with hunger. The police, coppers with clubs and stiff hats, wander through in pairs, trying to look important. But everyone knows they can be bribed, and most of them look the other way unless you've truly bled all over the cobblestones. Justice is rare. Bribery is common. And the air, it's no cleaner here than it was inside your room. Coal smoke pours from chimneys, mixing with fog until the world is one endless smear of grey. You taste it when you open your mouth. It clings to your coat, your hair, your bread. Every breath feels like inhaling through a dirty rag. Children cough as they run, their laughter broken into fits. Men hack into the gutter, spit black, and keep walking. No one notices. No one has the time. When it rains, the street becomes a river of filth. Water rushes down, dragging ash waste, and who knows what along with it. Boots splash, skirts drag, wheels slice through the muck. You trudge forward, knowing your feet won't dry for days. The smell rises, sharp and choking, and the fog only traps it closer. But the city doesn't stop. People push through, shoulders hunched, eyes narrowed, as if daring the weather to do its worst. Noise never leaves you here. A bell rings out from St. Paul's, muffled by the fog. A woman shouts at a vendor, accusing him of watering down her milk. A man curses as his cart tips into a rut. Children laugh in bursts, high and fleeting, before vanishing into the chaos again. Every sound collides with another until the whole city feels like it's shouting at you. You move through it, part of it, swallowed whole. Even the smell is constant, an invisible blanket you can't push away. Coal smoke, horse manure, rotting food, the sour stench of spilled beer from the night before, sweat from bodies pressed too close together. Somewhere, faintly, the smell of bread baking, sweet, warm, inviting. But it belongs to someone else, a man behind a door you'll never knock on. Out here, the dominant perfume is survival. And yet, for all its dangers, the street is unavoidable. It's the artery of the city, the only path from hunger to food, from poverty to wages. Every errand drags you into it. Every job demands you walk it. Every day begins and ends here. You don't have the luxury of avoiding it. You learn to dodge carriages like a dance, to walk with one hand guarding your pocket, to step lightly over puddles while pretending you don't know what's in them. You adapt, or you disappear. But sometimes, even in this monster of a street, life finds a way to remind you that you're human. A stranger steadying you when you nearly fall. A child offering you half a roasted chestnut he couldn't finish. A woman laughing too loudly at some private joke as she balances a basket on her head. For just a moment, the city feels less like a beast and more like a strange, chaotic family. Harsh, loud, unkind, but still alive. Still, by the time you reach the end of the block, your shoulders ache from tensing, your throat burns from the smoke, and your pockets feel lighter, even if you swear you didn't stop. The street has taken its toll, and it always will. Because in Victorian London, the streets aren't just a place you walk, they're an adversary you wrestle every single day. They test your balance, your patience, your luck. They chew at your boots, your lungs, your spirit. And no matter how many times you walk them, they never grow easier. You step forward anyway, because what choice do you have? The monster doesn't sleep, and if you stop moving, it'll swallow you whole. You've survived the streets, barely. You've dodged carts and carriages, leapt over gutters that look more like open sewers, and clutched your coat tight against quick fingers, trying to lighten your pockets. But the real monster of Victorian London isn't just the fog or the filth. It's waiting at the end of the street. It's the job. And here, a job isn't pride. It isn't purpose. It's survival in its cruelest form. Work in this city isn't about building a future. It's about making it to the end of the day with enough coins to buy bread and keep the landlord from throwing you out. Factories rise like blackened cathedrals, their chimneys pumping smoke into skies already heavy with coal. Inside, the noise is deafening. Metal clanks, gears grind, steam hisses, the floor trembles under the weight of machines that never rest. Men shuffle in by the dozen, women trail behind, children dart between, all swallowed by the great iron mouth of industry. A factory shift isn't 8 hours, neatly boxed into morning and afternoon. It's 12, sometimes 16, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The whistle blows before dawn, and you stumble in still half asleep. By the time it shrieks again, the sun has set, and your body feels twice as old as when you woke. Wages barely feed a well-fed cat, but you cling to them anyway. Without work, there's nothing. If you're a man, maybe you haul coal, stack bricks, bend your back on the docks. Your muscles strain, your skin splits, your lungs choke with dust. You swallow the pain because pain doesn't buy bread. You keep your head down because complaining just gets you replaced by someone hungrier. You tell yourself you'll last until 40, but you've seen men half that age cough themselves into the grave. If you're a woman, the work doesn't stop. Laundries are endless pits of steam and soap, your hands red and raw from scrubbing clothes that don't belong to you. Buttons and seams blur together as you stitch for hours in dim light, eyes burning, fingers bleeding. Some women crouch over factory tables, dipping matches into white phosphorus, the fumes sinking into their bones. The disease it breeds has a name, phocy jaw. First the pain, then the swelling, then the smell, and finally the jawbone itself, rotting away piece by piece. Management shrugs. Matches must be made. And then there are the children. In London, childhood is a myth. If you're small enough to crawl, you're employable. Chimney sweeps send boys up flues no wider than their shoulders, scraping soot as they climb, naked to keep from getting stuck. If they freeze halfway, a fire is lit beneath them to encourage movement. If they die, another boy is sent up to finish the job. Others crawl under roaring machines in textile mills, sweeping scraps away while gears spin inches from their faces. They move fast, or they don't move again. Some children become mudlarks, picking through the Thames at low tide. Their hands plunge into sludge, pulling out rope, nails, bones, anything that can be sold for a penny. They come home soaked, shivering, carrying disease like an extra shadow. Others sell newspapers, polish boots, or carry messages across streets that don't care if they make it to the other side. Every child is useful here, if only as cheap labour. Childhood in London isn't stolen. It's simply never offered. The air inside these workplaces is thick with dust, soot and sweat. Your lungs feel heavy after a single hour, and yet you keep breathing because you must. If you lose a finger, no one stops the machine. If your hand gets caught, someone prays it free and work continues. If you collapse, someone drags you aside, and your spot is filled before the sweat has dried on the floorboards. Safety isn't a right. It isn't even a thought. Foremen stalk the rows like vultures, barking orders, slapping shoulders, shouting for more speed. Breaks are rare, and food is a crust shoved into your mouth with dirty fingers. Water isn't clean, so you gulp tea if you can afford it, or beer if you're lucky. The The factory doesn't care if you're tired, sick, or starving. The machines must keep moving, and so must you. Workhouses are no kinder. They're the city's cruel answer to poverty, promising help but delivering punishment. You enter desperate and hungry, and in exchange for food that tastes like boiled despair, you work until your body breaks. Stones are crushed, oakum is picked, floors are scrubbed until they shine with misery. Families are separated, men to one side, women to another, children scattered. The workhouse doesn't heal. It humbles, it breaks, it reminds you that poverty is a sin to be punished, not a wound to be mended. Even the jobs that sound harmless carry their curses. Seamstresses ruin their eyes in dim corners. Dock workers lose their backs to heavy loads. Miners choke underground, lungs filling with coal dust until every cough brings up black. None of it is safe. None of it is secure. Work is a slow death chosen only because the alternative is faster. And yet, people keep showing up. They drag themselves from bed through the fog into the factory because there's bread at stake, rent at stake, life itself at stake. Every shift is a wager. Give a piece of yourself today. Hope there's enough left tomorrow to do it again. You look around and see bodies bent, faces hollow, eyes glazed from exhaustion. A man with only 4 fingers on his left hand. A woman with red raw arms from boiling wash water. A boy coughing black suit into a rag he hides from his master. This isn't progress. This isn't prosperity. It's survival wrapped in soot and sweat, painted as industry. And still, in rare moments, humanity leaks through the cracks. A worker shares a crust with the man beside him. A woman hums a lullaby while she sews, her voice softening the clatter of the machines. A boy jokes about the soot in his teeth, flashing a grin despite the cough that follows. Even here, under the crushing weight of labor, the spark refuses to die. But make no mistake, work in Victorian London doesn't lift you out of poverty. It pins you there. It keeps you just alive enough to show up tomorrow, just fed enough to keep turning the gears. The factory doesn't free you. It chains you one shift at a time until your body gives out and someone younger, smaller, hungrier takes your place. By the end of the day, your muscles ache, your lungs burn, your hands shake. You stumble back through the streets, past the gutters, past the shouting vendors, back to the one-room home that smells of damp and sweat. You collapse onto straw that scratches your skin, and you don't rest. You just wait for the whistle to call you again, because in London, a job isn't a future. It's just a way to survive until tomorrow. And tomorrow, the machine will still be waiting. You might think childhood is about play, about school, about chasing dreams too big for your small body. Not here, not in Victorian London. Childhood in this city isn't a season of innocence. It's a race to see how quickly you can become useful, how early you can carry weight on shoulders that barely fit a shirt. If you're small enough to crawl, congratulations. You're old enough to work. The chimney is one of the first places a child might be sent. Picture a flue no wider than a dinner plate, black with soot, twisting up through a house like a narrow throat. Now imagine a boy no older than 5, naked to keep from getting stuck, knees and elbows raw from scraping against brick. He climbs because his master tells him to. He climbs because there's no choice. If he pauses halfway, a brimstone candle might be lit beneath him, the smoke urging him to keep moving. If he cries, a stick pokes at his feet until he learns that silence is safer. Some don't climb back down. They wedge in tight, swallowed by the chimney, their bodies found days later when the smoke won't clear. Those who survive carry soot everywhere. It lines their lungs, it stains their skin, it settles into their sleep. Some develop a disease so particular it bears their trade's name: chimney sweeps carcinoma, cancer of the scrotum, the first industrial cancer ever recorded. Imagine being 10 years old, already scarred, already dying, because your childhood was traded for clean fireplaces in someone else's home. If not the chimney, perhaps the match factory. Girls as young as 8 stand over long tables, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus, the fumes rising like an invisible curse. At first, it's just a toothache. Then the pain spreads, swelling the jaw until the skin glows faintly in the dark. Locals call it phossy jaw, and it's as horrific as it sounds. Bone rots. Flesh decays. A smell clings to the victim so strong that people step aside in the street. The cure? Surgery, if you can afford it, though most cannot. So the girl works until she can't, her pay just pennies, her body dissolving in slow motion. Other children work the river. At low tide, they scramble through black mud, their small hands searching for scraps of rope, nails, bones. Anything that might fetch a halfpenny. These mudlarks come home soaked to the waist, their clothes stiff with filth, their skin blistered from cold. Disease follows them like a shadow, typhoid, dysentery, fevers with no name. But tomorrow, they'll go back, because the Thames may poison, but it also pays. Some boys and girls hawk goods on the street. Newspapers, matches, roasted chestnuts they can't afford to taste. They run fast, weaving between carriages, shouting headlines they barely understand. A wrong step, and they're trampled beneath a horse's hooves. A wrong look, and a grown man might cuff them aside just for being in the way. They learn quick smile when you sell, duck when you must, and run when things turn ugly. Factories love children too. They're small enough to crawl under machines, quick enough to dart between moving gears. The machines never stop, so the children don't either. They sweep scraps away with bare hands, hoping their sleeves don't catch. One mistake and a finger is gone. Two mistakes and a hand. No one pauses. The machine keeps running, and another child fills the gap. To the foreman, kids aren't children. They're tools, cheap, replaceable, silent if trained well enough. School, that's for the fortunate few. For most, the classroom is the factory floor, the riverbank, the chimney shaft. Lessons are taught by hunger and survival, not chalk and slate. A child learns to read the mood of a master, the weight of a loaf of bread, the sound of a coin hitting the table. Numbers aren't for sums, they're for wages. How many pennies you earned, how many mouths you can feed, how many hours until you collapse. And yet, in the cracks between labour, childhood flickers. A boy flicks a pebble down the street, pretending it's a toy. Girls sing songs in alleys while their hands are still raw from work. Mudlarks laugh as they splash each other with water too filthy to drink. In moments stolen from the grind, they create games with scraps of wood, jokes with soot-smudged faces, dreams whispered under blankets. Play doesn't disappear. It shrinks, it hides, it sneaks in where it can. But these moments don't erase the weight. A child who should be chasing kites is climbing chimneys. A girl who should be braiding her doll's hair is losing her own teeth to phosphorus. A boy who should be in a classroom is coughing black into a rag. Childhood here isn't stolen in one dramatic swoop. It's shaved away piece by piece, until all that's left is a small body carrying adult burdens. The city notices, in its own twisted way. Writers like Dickens spin stories of Oliver Twist, little boys caught in the gears of poverty. Readers clutch their books and gasp at the cruelty, then look away when they pass a real child begging on the street. Parliament debates reforms, but progress crawls. The work is too cheap, the profits too sweet, the children too voiceless. And so the cycle continues. Small feet climb chimneys, small lungs dip matches, small lungs breathe soot. Childhood dissolves into labour before it ever really begins. The city grows fat on the backs of its youngest workers, their laughter fading into coughs, their games ending in exhaustion. But even here, in the soot and sweat, they endure. They laugh when they can. They run when their legs will carry them. They hold on to life, even when life refuses to hold on to them. Childhood in Victorian London isn't gentle, isn't fair, but it's proof that even the smallest shoulders can carry the heaviest load. If men carried the coal and children climbed the chimneys, women carried the weight of everything in between. In Victorian London, being a woman didn't mean you worked less. It meant you worked twice, once for your own household, once for someone else's. And none of it came with applause, none of it with medals. Only Coluse's exhaustion and a society that demanded you smile through it all. If you were unmarried, odds were good you'd end up in service. Domestic servants made up a huge portion of the female workforce, and their lives were built around other people's comfort. Imagine waking before dawn, already moving before the sun even thinks about rising. You stoke fires you don't get to sit beside. You haul buckets of water up endless staircases, your arms aching long before the day has truly begun. You blacken hearths until your knees are raw, polish brass until your reflection stares back dull and tired, scrub floors until your hands sting with lye. Breakfast isn't yours to eat. It's yours to cook, to carry upstairs, to place neatly on a table you'll never sit at. You eat later, if there's anything left, and usually you stand while you do it, because there's always another chore waiting. You wash, you iron, you sew, you sweep. You fetch coal until your back screams. And when the master or mistress calls, you answer, no matter how heavy your legs feel or how hot your forehead burns. Your bed is a narrow cot in the attic, a place so small the ceiling slopes, too low to stand. But at least it's indoors, at least it's dry. That counts as luck here. If you were married, you didn't escape the grind. In fact, you inherited double. The household might be a single filthy room, but you keep it running anyway. You raise the children, 3, maybe 4, maybe more, because birth control isn't something you've ever heard of. You cook with nothing, stretch pennies until they snap, scrub clothes in water that freezes your fingers, patch holes in trousers until the cloth is more patch than original. And then, because 3 shillings and a prayer don't stretch far enough, you take in laundry for richer households, bending over steaming tubs until your arms tremble, your skin red and raw. Some women stitch in corners by dim candlelight, sewing buttons, hemming shirts, mending trousers. 14 hours bent over a needle for pennies so small they barely buy bread. Your eyesight fades, your fingers crack, and if blood stains the fabric, you're docked pay. Seamstresses often said they stitched their lives away, and it wasn't just a figure of speech. Factories took women too. The match factories were full of them, young, old, it didn't matter. You dipped sticks into phosphorus, the air thick with poison. At first it felt like a toothache. Then your jaw swelled, then it glowed faintly in the dark, a horror people whispered about. Cossy jaw, they called it. Your face rotting, your bones dying while you still breathed. Management claimed it was your fault for chewing gum or biting your nails. The truth, they didn't care. Matches were cheap, women cheaper. And when all else failed, when the washing and sewing and scrubbing didn't keep the landlord away, the streets became the last resort. Sex work was everywhere in London, legal enough to be ignored but condemned loudly in drawing rooms, where the same men might visit after dark. Women stood in foggy alleys, on corners under gaslight, in doorways too narrow to shelter them from the rain. A night might earn you enough for food, for rent, maybe even coal. But it might also earn you bruises, disease or a trip to the police station if the constables felt like making an example. Respectability was never an option. Survival, and through it all, women were expected to be the moral center of the home. Keep things clean, keep children fed, keep spirits high. Even when the floor had no boards, even when the baby coughed blood, even when the cupboard was bare, society measured a woman's worth not by how much she endured, but by how quietly she endured it. But women didn't just suffer, they carried each other too. In shared washhouses, laughter bubbled between buckets. Jokes were whispered while hands scrubbed sore. Stories passed from one laundress to another, bits of gossip and dreams carried on the steam. In cramped kitchens, neighbours shared loaves, exchanged scraps of thread, passed babies back and forth when one pair of arms grew too tired. They survived not by breaking but by bending, by leaning on one another when the weight was too much for one set of shoulders alone. Sometimes, resilience showed in the smallest details. A seamstress humming while her fingers bled, a servant sneaking a glance into the grand dining hall, imagining what it might feel like to sit at that table, a mother sewing a doll out of scraps for her child, stuffing it with rags because cotton was too dear. These moments weren't victories in the grand sense, but they were survival, and survival in Victorian London was no small feat. Women carried the weight of their households, their children, their husbands, and still the city expected more. And somehow, impossibly, they delivered. They bent, they endured, they whispered jokes in the washhouses, they swept the doorsteps because someone had to. They found strength in exhaustion, dignity in despair, solidarity in silence. And in doing so, they kept families alive, streets alive, London itself alive. Because if men built the empire's factories and children fed its chimneys, it was women who stitched, scrubbed, and carried the pieces together. And though history often forgot their names, their hands were in every thread, every loaf, every life that managed to scrape by. You might think the hardest part of Victorian London was the hunger, or the endless hours of labour, or the streets that seemed determined to swallow you whole. But the truth is, the most dangerous enemy here isn't one you can dodge. It isn't a carriage thundering past or a factory machine waiting to snatch your hand. It's smaller, invisible. It lurks in the air you breathe, in the water you drink, in the very walls of the room where you sleep. It's disease, and it's everywhere. Start with the Thames, the great river that cuts through the heart of London. To some, it's lifeblood. To most, it's poison. By the mid-1800s, the Thames wasn't just a river. It was the city's toilet, its trash heap, its graveyard. Imagine a stew of rotting vegetables, chemical runoff from factories, animal carcasses, and human waste all stirred together under the summer sun. That's the same river people fetched water from, the same river where children played along the banks, the same river that reflected Parliament's windows. You scoop a bucket, lift it to your lips, and take a sip. Maybe you boil it first, maybe you don't. Either way, you're gambling. Cholera waits in that cup, invisible and patient. One moment you feel fine. The next, your stomach cramps. Your body empties itself faster than you can comprehend. And within hours you're shriveled, weak, lying on a cot praying the wave passes. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. Cholera isn't picky. It sweeps through whole streets in days. Pumps are chained shut after too many deaths, but always too late. Families vanish in a week. Funerals follow funerals until the grave diggers can't keep pace. Between 1848 and 1849, more than 14,000 Londoners died in a single outbreak. Over the decades, nearly 40,000 were lost to this one disease alone. And yet, for years, no one wanted to admit the truth, that it was the water itself carrying death from one mouth to the next. Then there's typhoid, riding the same channels, creeping through pumps and pipes like a silent thief. You never know where it's hiding. Maybe in the bucket you filled at dawn. Maybe in the rag you soaked to wipe a fevered brow. Maybe in the stew that tasted fine until the cramps began. Typhoid doesn't roar like cholera. It creeps, slowly, steadily, until whole households are coughing, sweating. Tuberculosis, consumption, they called it, was even crueler. You knew it by the cough, low and deep, rattling in the chest like a hidden drum. It stole breath one lungful at a time, leaving bodies pale, eyes sunken, lips stained with blood. It could linger for years, a slow erosion of strength, turning once strong men into husks, once vibrant women into shadows. Everyone knew someone who had it. Everyone feared waking with that same cough in their chest. And the city itself seemed designed to help these killers thrive. 10 people crammed into one damp room, no ventilation, windows sealed with soot. The perfect breeding ground for microbes, even if no one yet knew the word. Every cough spread further. Every sneeze carried risk. Every handshake, every touch, every shared bowl passed something invisible along. Illness wasn't just common. It was constant, baked into the rhythm of daily life like hunger and fog. Then came the great stink of 1858. That summer, the heat bore down mercilessly, drying the Thames until the sewage clung to its banks and baked in the sun. The stench was so unbearable that people vomited when they got too close. Parliament itself, perched right beside the river, had to hang soaked curtains to try to block the smell. Charles Dickens wrote that the Thames was a deadly sewer, and no one argued with him. It was the stink, not the staggering death tolls of cholera, that finally pushed the government into action. Engineers were summoned, sewers were planned, and slowly, painfully, London began to clean itself. But that was years away. For now, the stink was everywhere, and disease travelled with it. Medicine offered little comfort. Doctors spoke Latin while guessing at cures. Many still believed disease came from miasma, bad air, rather than water or germs. So they prescribed bleeding, leeches, mustard plasters, or opium by the spoonful. Laudanum, alcohol and opium mixed into one syrupy escape, was sold on every corner, given for coughs, fevers, grief, or just the misery of surviving another day. It didn't cure you. It just made you care less while you wasted away. Hospitals weren't heavens either. Overcrowded, foul-smelling, with instruments rarely washed between patients. Surgeons wiped their hands on their aprons and carried on. An operation was performed without gloves, without antiseptic, often without anesthesia. A toothache could lead to infection, and infection could lead to death. A cut, a splinter, a scrape. Small things became final things. And yet, somehow, people adapted. They boiled their tea. They sniffed milk suspiciously. They avoided pumps rumoured to be cursed, even if no one could explain why. Mothers held damp cloths to fevered brows, whispered prayers into tiny ears, and hoped the night would pass without another loss. Neighbours traded remedies, herbs, anything that might help. Some swore by vinegar, others by gin, others by hope itself. The invisible killers ruled the city, but Londoners learned to live alongside them, because there was no other choice. They endured the coughs, the fevers, the endless funerals. They kept moving, kept working, kept loving in the face of death that could strike any day, any hour, from the water in a cup, or the breath of a friend. And so, in Victorian London, you didn't just fight hunger or poverty or cold. You fought the air, you fought the water, you fought the invisible, and most of the time, the invisible won. When the workhouse broke you, when the factory chewed you up, when hunger sat in your stomach like a stone, there was still one more road left in Victorian London. It wasn't paved with good intentions. It was paved with risk, with shadows, with the constant threat of a constable's club. It was crime. And for thousands, it wasn't rebellion. It wasn't mischief. It was the only way to stay alive. It usually started small. A loaf of bread left too close to the edge of a stall. A scarf dangling from a distracted woman's arm. A pocket watch glinting against a gentleman's waistcoat. One bump, one brush of the hand, and you were gone, blending into the fog before anyone realized their fortune had lightened. Pickpockets, dippers, in the slang of the day, were everywhere. Dickens made Oliver Twist famous, but the real boys and girls darting through the crowds weren't singing in musicals. They were starving. They knew that a quick hand meant supper, and a slow one meant prison, or worse. Gangs of children ran the streets, led by older boys who taught them tricks, how to cut a pocket with a small knife, how to distract a mark with a question, how to scatter if the police gave chase. They had territories, codes, signals, an underground map of the city drawn in whispers. Some were caught and sent to Newgate prison, their sentences as brutal as any adult's. Others were shipped off to Australia, transported across the world for stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief. But more kept coming, because hunger kept teaching the same lesson: theft was quicker than begging. Women found their own corners of the criminal world. Some became fences, buying stolen goods for pennies and reselling them under layers of shawls and lies. Others ran twilight houses, safe drops where thieves could stash their loot until the streets were clear. Many slipped between crime and survival so seamlessly that it became impossible to tell the difference. Was selling watered-down milk fraud, or just business? Was passing off bruised fruit as fresh a scam, or simply survival in a city that never gave second chances? Then there were the swindlers, masters of fast talk. 3-card mont on a crate in the market, coins flashing, hands moving quick enough to fool even the sharp-eyed. Card tricks, dice loaded with lead, lotteries rigged before you bought your ticket. Hope was sold for pennies, and when it vanished, so did the cellar. By the time you realized you'd been played, the man was gone, already setting up 2 streets away. And at night, the stakes grew higher. Burglary was the path for the bold and the desperate. Warehouses, shops, sometimes even churches. Locks were flimsy, windows easy to pry. A dark alley, a quick climb, and you might stumble into enough goods to sell for a week's worth of bread. But the risk was sharp. A guard's shout, a constable's heavy boots, the swing of a club. Punishments were harsh. Branding, flogging, prison, transportation. Every theft was a gamble, and the odds were stacked against you. Some crimes were darker still. Resurrection men crept through cemeteries at night, spades in hand, eyes on fresh graves. Bodies weren't sacred in Victorian London. They were valuable. Medical schools needed cadavers for study, and supply never met demand. So the resurrection men dug, lifting corpses from the earth, stuffing them into sacks, and hauling them to back doors of anatomy theatres. It was gruesome, illegal, and far more profitable than sewing buttons for pennies. Families placed iron cages over graves or hired guards to watch the dead. But the trade went on, fueled by desperation on one side and education on the other. Organised crime blossomed in the shadows. Gangs carved out neighbourhoods, ran protection schemes, smuggled goods through the docks. They had leaders, hierarchies, sometimes even uniforms. They weren't just thugs. They were businesses, brutal but efficient, thriving in a city where the law was too thin to stretch across every foggy street. Some constables looked the other way, pockets lined with bribes. Others fought, but always too late, always outnumbered. And hanging over it all was the simple truth: crime wasn't about greed for most. It wasn't about gold watches or silk scarves. It was about bread, about rent, about not starving in the streets while your children cried themselves hoarse. When survival is the prize, morality becomes flexible. But crime carried its own dangers. Violence was never far away. A thief caught in the act could be beaten senseless before the police even arrived. A woman working the alleys risked attack every night, her only defense a shout no one might answer. Betrayal was common, partners vanishing with the loot, gangs turning on their own, fences cheating sellers out of their few shillings. The criminal world was as harsh as the legal one, and sometimes crueler. Still, the fog gave cover and desperation gave courage. You slipped a hand into a pocket because your stomach demanded it. You sold bruised fruit as fresh because your children needed shoes. You dug in the mud for scraps because a penny today was the difference between life and death tomorrow. Crime wasn't a choice. It was a language, a currency, a survival strategy whispered through every alley and shadow. And yet, even here, humanity lingered. Thieves shared coins with one another when a haul was good. A fence slipped a few extra pennies to a girl who looked too thin. A gang leader let a boy keep his first stolen watch instead of taking it. The criminal world was brutal, yes, but it was also strangely communal, because no one survives alone in London, not even in the underworld. So when the honest work fails, when hunger gnaws, when the city turns its back, you step into the fog, eyes sharp, heart racing. You dip a hand into a stranger's pocket. You sell a lie with a smile. You gamble your safety against your stomach. And for one more night, one more day, you win. You've made it through the fog, past the gutters, through the factory floor, maybe even through a night dodging the constable's boots. But in Victorian London, surviving the streets and the work wasn't enough. At some point, your body would fail you. A cough that wouldn't go away. A cut that turned red and angry. A fever that made your skin burn and your teeth chatter all at once. And when that happened, you faced another enemy, medicine. Not the kind we know today, not clean, professional, or even particularly effective. Medicine here was a gamble, and most of the time, the house won. Start with the doctors. They meant well, sometimes. They had books, theories, training in grand halls. But their science was shaky, their tools brutal, and their confidence unshakable, even when they were wrong. Many still believed in miasma, the idea that bad smells caused disease. If you were sick, it wasn't germs or contaminated water. It was foul air creeping into your lungs, a punishment for living in filth or, some said, for lacking moral character. They couldn't see bacteria, but they could smell sewage, so they trusted their noses more than their eyes. If you went to a doctor with a fever, he might nod wisely, scribble notes you couldn't read, and prescribe bleeding. Yes, bleeding. Out came the leeches or the lancet, a small blade to nick your skin. The idea was simple: drain away the bad blood and balance your humours. The reality was weakness, dizziness, and sometimes death from losing more blood than the fever itself would have taken. Still, doctors swore by it. If you died, it was because you were too weak. If you lived, it was because their treatment worked. Either way, their confidence stayed intact. Other remedies weren't much kinder. Mustard plasters slapped onto your chest, burning your skin in the hopes of drawing out illness. Emetics to make you vomit until your ribs ached. Enemas for fevers, toothaches, grief, you name it. Some doctors prescribed electricity, a mild shock to stimulate your failing body, as if a jolt of lightning might scare you back into health. None of it was particularly pleasant. None of it was particularly effective. And then there was laudanum, sweet syrupy, available on nearly every corner. A mix of alcohol and opium, laudanum was the Victorian cure-all. Cough, laudanum, stomachache, laudanum, tooth pain, laudanum. Grieving the loss of your 8th child. Double the dose. It dulled pain, quieted babies, and made the world seem softer, easier, calmer. It also created addicts by the thousands and solved nothing at all. But in a city where options were few and pain was constant, laudanum was both blessing and curse, cradling Londoners in a warm haze even as it pulled them further from reality. If you couldn't afford a doctor, and most couldn't, you turned to the chemist. The chemist's shop was the poor man's hospital, shelves lined with bottles of powders and potions, each promising relief for a price. Herbal remedies sat beside harsh chemicals. A tonic might brighten your day, or it might rot your stomach lining. A powder might ease your headache, or it might poison you slowly. Labels weren't always clear, and regulation was a word no one had invented yet. Buying medicine was like tossing dice in a crooked game, and if the chemist was too dear, you stayed home. Mothers brewed teas from herbs, rubbed onion poultices on chests, pressed vinegar-soaked rags to hot foreheads. Neighbours whispered remedies, passed down through generations. Some worked, most didn't, but all gave hope, because when hope is all you have, it's enough to try. Hospitals. Best to avoid them if you could. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and terrifying. Beds crammed shoulder to shoulder, patients coughing, groaning, sometimes screaming. The air stank of blood, sweat, and infection. Instruments weren't sterilized. Surgeons wiped their hands on aprons already stiff with dried stains. Gloves were rare, antiseptics a dream not yet embraced. If you needed an operation, you were strapped down, handed a stick to bite, and prayed the surgeon was quick with his saw. Anesthesia existed, chloroform ether, but wasn't always used. Many believed speed was enough. Amputation could take less than 2 minutes. Infection could take your life in less than a week. Even childbirth, the most ordinary of human experiences, carried a heavy price. Women went into labour knowing it might end with a baby or a burial. Midwives did their best with what little they had. But infections raged, and bleeding could not always be stopped. Some hospitals recorded maternal mortality rates that would shock us now, but were accepted then as simply the way of things. A mother might give birth to 6 children and bury 3, and then she would rise the next morning and get back to work, because life demanded it. It wasn't all hopeless. A few pioneers whispered about cleanliness, about washing hands, about antiseptics. Joseph Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid in the 1860s, slowly proving that germs, tiny, invisible things, were the true killers. But many of his peers scoffed. How dare anyone suggest that a gentleman doctor's hands carried filth? Pride delayed progress, and patients kept dying while the old guard clung to their theories. For ordinary people, the lesson was simple: avoid doctors if you can, survive without hospitals if possible, and pray your body is strong enough to heal on its own. because sometimes the treatment killed quicker than the illness. And yet, even in this bleak landscape, Londoners endured. They faced fevers with grit, swallowed bitter tonics with hope, clutched their children through coughing fits, and carried on. Not because medicine healed them, but because survival demanded it. And in Victorian London, survival was its own kind of miracle. Daytime in Victorian London was bad enough. The filth, the noise, the endless grind of work and hunger. But when the sun dipped, what little sun managed to pierce the fog, things didn't soften. They sharpened. The city after dark was a different beast entirely. If the streets by day were a monster, then by night they became its shadow, stretching long, twisting strange, swallowing whole anyone foolish or desperate enough to linger too long outside. The gas lamps flickered to life, lined up like sentries, their yellow light barely cutting through the fog. Instead of banishing the dark, they seemed to carve it into smaller, meaner pieces. Every alley was a throat you didn't want to step into. Every doorway a mouth waiting to swallow you. Shapes moved at the edges of vision. Maybe a drunk weaving home. Maybe a pickpocket looking for a mark. Maybe something worse. The fog blurred the line between the two, and in that blur lived danger. Footsteps echoed differently at night. A steady rhythm behind you, matching yours, just far enough to raise the hairs on your neck. You glance back, nothing. Or at least, nothing you can see through the haze, but you feel watched. London after dark was full of eyes, and not all of them belonged to the living. The constables patrolled in pairs, swinging their truncheons, trying to look confident. But even they avoided certain streets, Whitechapel, Limehouse. Whole neighbourhoods whispered about, places where shadows walked faster than the law. If you were unlucky enough to wander there in the 1880s, you might hear the name that froze everyone's blood, Jack the Ripper. He was never caught, never named, just another figure swallowed by the fog. But his legend clung to London nights, proof that the darkness wasn't just uncomfortable. It was lethal. For women, the risk tripled. Men loitered at corners, leaning from the shadows with whispers, offers, threats. Some followed, some didn't bother with subtlety. Every gaslit step was a gamble. Do you walk faster? Do you turn? Do you trust that the footsteps behind you are just coincidence? Many women didn't have the choice to avoid the streets. Sex work was survival, and survival meant standing in doorways under flickering lamps, hoping the man who stopped wasn't cruel, or drunk, or violent, hoping you'd earn enough to keep your children fed, your landlord quiet, your body safe for one more night. Even staying indoors wasn't safe. Tenements groaned and cracked, rats scuttled behind the walls. Arguments rose through the floors, some ending in shattered glass, others in fists. A candle knocked over could set the whole building ablaze, fire racing through dry wood, while neighbours shouted and threw buckets of water in a panic. No smoke alarms, no fire brigade arriving in minutes. Just chaos, and if you were lucky, escape. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. People curled on straw mats or narrow cots, ears tuned to every creak of the stairs, every cough through the walls, every rat scratching in the corner. The city didn't fall silent. It only shifted tones. The clip-clop of horses gave way to the slurred songs of drunks, the shrill cries of fights spilling into the street, the eerie silence that fell right before something worse happened. The fog crept under doors, curled through window cracks, settled over faces like a damp shroud. You lit a candle and prayed it wouldn't gutter out, because stumbling in the dark meant tripping over furniture, or worse, over someone else's sleeping body. In some homes, children clung to hot bricks wrapped in cloth, a poor man's blanket against the night cold. In others, mothers whispered lullabies over coughing babies, voices cracking as if song alone might guard them. And still the night stretched on, hours that seemed longer than the day, every minute stretched tight by fear and exhaustion. The darkness didn't comfort, it threatened. The city didn't rest, it prowled. But even in this fog-choked night, resilience flickered. Neighbours shared candles, shared hot bricks, shared stories whispered in the dark. Pubs filled with laughter and songs, the sound spilling into the street like defiance itself. Even the smallest kindness, a hand steadying you on a slippery stair, a stranger walking you part-way home, cut through the gloom like a gas lamp, burning just a little brighter than it should, because in Victorian London, night wasn't peace. Night was risk. But somehow, people survived it the same way they survived the hunger, the filth, the disease. By clinging to each other, by pushing forward, by daring the darkness to do its worst. For all the soot, for all the hunger, for all the endless coughing in the fog, there was still something alive in Victorian London that no amount of filth or fear could kill. Humanity. Not the polished, noble kind written in history books, but the raw, stubborn kind. The kind that shows up in the smallest moments, in gestures so quiet they could almost be missed. And yet, those tiny sparks kept people going when everything else told them to give up. You saw it in the neighbour who slipped a half loaf of bread to a family that ran out 2 days before payday. No speeches, no fuss, just bread passed hand to hand, hope disguised as crust and crumb. You saw it in the mother who gave her last a penny to a barefoot child whose feet bled on the cobblestones. She knew it meant she'd go without tea, but she also knew some hunger was easier to bear than watching a child bleed. Even in the tenements, where walls dripped and rats scratched, kindness survived. A hot brick, wrapped in cloth and passed to the neighbour's baby on a freezing night. A lullaby hummed soft enough to soothe not just the singer's child, but the neighbour's too. A bucket of water hauled up the stairs for someone too weak to fetch their own. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't history-making sacrifices. They were survival shared, and survival shared was always easier. The pubs roared with that same resilience. They were dirty, smoky and crowded, but they were alive. A man with suit still streaking his face sang until his voice cracked, and others joined in, mugs raised high. Women laughed at jokes told 1,000 times, because even an old joke was better than silence. A fiddler played in the corner, blind but steady, the bow dancing across strings that sang of something brighter than the world outside. For a few hours, bruises faded, hunger eased, grief softened. All dulled the edge, songs sharpened the spirit. The pub wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place to remember that life, however hard, could still be lived. On the streets, penny dreadfuls passed from hand to hand, their lurid tales of crime and mystery offering escape for a single coin. Children gathered to hear stories read aloud, their laughter rising above the sound of horses and hawkers. Street performers, jugglers, singers, acrobats, worked for pennies, yes, but also gave something priceless: distraction, joy, a reminder that the city wasn't all coughing and hunger. Even work carried flickers of humanity. A factory boy sharing his crust with another who had none. A chimney sweep teaching a younger child how not to get stuck on his first climb. A woman humming as she sewed, her tune softening the endless clatter of machines. The acts were small, almost invisible against the backdrop of suffering. But they mattered. They mattered because they proved that people were not just cogs in the empire's machine. They were human, stubbornly, painfully human. Families held on to each other too. Parents rocked fevered children through long nights, whispering stories even when they knew the fever might not break. Siblings shared boots, one wearing them to work in the morning, the other in the afternoon. Husbands and wives split crusts of bread in half, one pretending they weren't hungry so the other would eat. They fell in love, even in the slums. They married, even when the world told them it was foolish. They brought children into a city that seemed determined to break them, because hope, even fragile hope, was worth the risk. Londoners didn't lie despite the suffering. They lived through it, with it, carrying their pain alongside their laughter. They were not just victims of fog and disease. They were survivors, builders, dreamers. They carried the empire on their backs, often barefoot, often ignored, but never entirely broken. And when you look back now, sitting in a world with clean water, antibiotics, and light at the flick of a switch, it's hard to imagine how they did it. How they survived mornings of soot, afternoons of toil, nights of fear. But the truth is, they had no choice. And so they endured. They shared, they sang, they loved, they hoped. They clung to one another when the system forgot them, when the city buried them, when the empire used them. The fog could choke them. The streets could swallow them. The water could break them. The water could poison them. But none of it, not even all of it together, could erase that flicker of humanity. That stubborn light burned on, dim at times but never gone. And in that light we see them not as statistics, not as soot-stained shadows, but as people, real people, who survived the impossible every single day. The fog of London lifts, and suddenly we're someplace else entirely. No chimneys, no coal smoke, no carts rattling over cobblestones. Instead, you feel the dry heat of the Mediterranean sun on your skin, see the mountains rising like stone guardians, and hear the clang of shields echoing across a dusty training ground. We've left the cramped tenements of the 19th century and stepped back 2,000 years to one of the most feared and admired cities of the ancient world, Sparta. And right at the center of this story is someone most history books barely mention, a woman named Gorgo. Now, you probably think you know Sparta, tough warriors, red cloaks, endless drills, and the legend of 300 men holding a pass against an empire. But here's the thing, Sparta wasn't just about the men. For all their fame, their discipline, their sacrifice, the women of Sparta lived lives that shocked the rest of Greece. While Athenian women were hidden in homes, expected to weave and keep silent, Spartan women walked boldly in public, owned land, managed businesses, and spoke their minds. And Gorgo, she wasn't just any Spartan woman. She was born into power, raised in politics, and destined to make her voice impossible to ignore. She entered the world as the daughter of King Cleomenes I, one of Sparta's 2 kings. That alone would have marked her life as extraordinary. But Cleomenes wasn't an ordinary ruler. He was powerful, cunning, and some said unstable. Ancient writers whispered that he veered between brilliance and madness. For young Gorgo, that meant her earliest lessons weren't fairy tales or nursery songs. They were political maneuverings, alliances made and broken, and the dangerous truth that kings could fall as quickly as they rose. Unlike girls elsewhere in Greece, Gorgo didn't grow up confined indoors. In Athens, women rarely left the house and had little education. But in Sparta, things were different. Spartan girls trained like boys, running, wrestling, throwing javelins, even racing one another in front of crowds. It wasn't sport for sport's sake. The Spartans believed that strong women bore strong sons, and in a city where men marched off to war again and again, survival depended on that. So Gorgo grew up with muscles in her legs, a sharp mind in her head, and a culture that expected her to use both. By the time she was 8 or 9, her sharpness was already on display. There's a story, one of those rare moments in history where a woman's words were actually written down. A foreign ambassador came to her father, King Cleomenes, with an offer, a bribe to support the Persian Empire. While the adults hesitated, whispering about what to do, little Gorgo stepped forward. "Father," she said, "you had better leave, or this stranger will corrupt you." Imagine it, a child, bold enough to cut through the whispers of men, warning a king about danger no one else wanted to name. And Cleomenes listened. The ambassador was dismissed, the bribe refused. From that day, people knew this girl wasn't to be underestimated. Life in Sparta wasn't easy for anyone, even royalty. The city was obsessed with discipline, with order, with sacrifice. Boys left their homes at 7 to begin military training, learning to fight, steal, and endure pain without complaint. Girls stayed home, but their education was no less intense. They were taught to be outspoken, to manage estates, to defend themselves. Spartan women were expected to be bold, because boldness was survival. Gorgo grew up in that fire, and it tempered her into steel long before she wore a crown. It's easy to imagine her as a teenager, watching from the edge of the training fields, as Spartan boys clashed with wooden swords, her arms, her eyes sharp, her tongue ready with a cutting remark. She learned not just from her father, but from the world around her. Lessons about honor, about discipline, about how quickly weakness was punished in this city. Every story she heard, every counsel she observed, every whisper of politics taught her that power wasn't given freely. It had to be taken, wielded, and defended. Her father's end was a reminder of that truth. Cleomenes eventually spiraled into madness, dying by suicide, leaving behind not just a fractured reputation, but also a daughter who had seen firsthand how dangerous the knife edge of power could be. Gorgo didn't flinch. She didn't retreat into silence. She carried those lessons forward, sharper than ever. When she married Leonidas, the man who would one day become Sparta's most famous king, it wasn't a tale of swooning romance. This wasn't Athens with its love poetry. This was Sparta. Marriage was about partnership, about strength, about creating the next generation of warriors. Leonidas was respected for his scars, not his charm, and Gorgo matched him stride for stride, not with a spear, but with her mind. Spartan queens weren't decorations. They were advisors, partners, sometimes even commanders in their own right. Leonidas didn't just get a wife. He got a strategist. From childhood, Gorgo had shown herself unafraid to speak truth to power. As queen, that sharpness only grew. Where other Greek queens might have been hidden, silent, unseen, Gorgo stood beside her husband, advising, questioning, warning. And when the time came for Leonidas to march toward Thermopylae, she didn't weep or plead. She gave him the words that still echo through history. Come back with your shield. Or on it. 6 words, sharper than any sword. A command that death in honor was better than life in shame. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a philosophy. It was Sparta distilled into a single sentence. And yet, before she became the queen whose words carried the weight of a nation, she was the girl who cut through whispers in her father's court. The girl who trained alongside boys. The girl who grew up knowing she could not afford softness. Gorgo's story reminds us that in Sparta, strength wasn't optional, and it wasn't only for men. Women bore it too, in their arms, in their voices, in their very bones. So when you picture Sparta, don't just see warriors lined up with shields and spears. See Gorgo standing behind them, small at first, then grown, her words as sharp as any blade, her will as unbending as any shield. She was proof that in a city built on discipline and defiance, even a young girl could step forward, look a king in the eye, and change the course of history. Marriage in Sparta wasn't a matter of moonlight sonnets or blushing brides weaving garlands. It was practical, stripped down, as blunt as the city that forged its warriors. And when Gorgo married Leonidas, the man history would remember for Thermopylae, it wasn't about romance in the Athenian sense. It was about partnership, mutual respect, a union that reflected the iron discipline of the land they ruled. Leonidas wasn't just any Spartan man. He was bred for war, trained since childhood in the agoge, the brutal Spartan education system where boys learned to fight, steal, endure, and obey. By the time he married Gorgo, he was scarred, seasoned, and defined by silence more than words. Spartans were famous for speaking little and striking hard. Leonidas embodied that. But Gorgo wasn't marrying a shadow of a man. She was marrying someone who recognized the strength in her sharpness. Unlike in Athens, where wives were tucked away behind high walls, Spartan queens stood beside their husbands. They were expected to speak, to advise, to take part in matters of politics and war. Gorgo was no exception. In fact, she was the very definition of it. Leonidas didn't just gain a wife. He gained a partner who wasn't afraid to speak in council, to offer judgment, to cut through the posturing of men with words as clean and sharp as a sword's edge. Their marriage was forged on equality as much as duty. She was his queen, but she was also his equal in intellect. When she spoke, he listened, not out of politeness, but out of recognition that her words carried weight. It's easy to imagine the two of them in their home, not whispering about sweet nothings, but discussing alliances, the threats of Persia, the shifting loyalties of neighboring states. This was Sparta. Sentiment took second place to survival, and in that sense, Gorgo and Leonidas were perfectly matched. Her role came into sharp relief during the tense years before Thermopylae. The Persian threat loomed large, their empire stretching across lands like a tidal wave, bearing down on Greece. While Athens debated endlessly in their assemblies, Sparta prepared. And Gorgo, at Leonidas's side, didn't flinch. She wasn't wringing her hands, pleading with him to stay. She was reminding him of who he was, who they were. When he set out to meet Xerxes' army, Gorgo gave him the words that would outlive them both. Come back with your shield, or on it. To outsiders, that might sound cold. To Spartans, it was the ultimate expression of loyalty and honor. A shield wasn't just wood and bronze. It was the piece of equipment that protected not just the warrior, but the man beside him. To return without it meant you had thrown it away to run. To return on it meant you had been carried home in death, but with honor intact. For Gorgo to say those words was not cruelty. It was faith. Faith that her husband would never shame himself or his people, even if it meant his life. And Leonidas lived by that code. At Thermopylae, he and his 300 Spartans, joined by allies, held the pass against a Persian army that dwarfed them in size. They fought to the last man, creating a story that echoed for centuries. And back in Sparta, Gorgo didn't crumble. She didn't retreat into silence or mourning. She carried on, embodying the resilience of her people, because Sparta didn't weep long for its dead. It honored them by enduring, by fighting on. But even before Thermopylae, Gorgo's wit and courage were legend. There's another story told of her. An Athenian woman once asked why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule their men. Gorgo's reply was sharp, fast, and devastating. Because we are the only women who give birth to men. 6 words that encapsulated not just her own pride, but the entire Spartan worldview. In a society built on strength, women weren't ornaments. They were the foundation. She wasn't afraid to speak in council either. Spartan men, famously laconic, often valued words only when they cut to the truth. Gorgo excelled at that. She was a woman who could silence a room not with volume, but with precision. Her words landed like spears, short, sharp, impossible to ignore. Her marriage to Leonidas wasn't one of dependency, but of partnership. When he marched to war, he knew she could hold her ground at home. When he made decisions in council, he knew she would challenge him if she thought him wrong. When she offered advice, he trusted it. That balance wasn't common in the ancient world. In Athens, women were shut away. In Persia, they lived in luxury but had little voice. In Sparta, Gorgo's voice mattered, and Leonidas knew it. Their bond wasn't gilded with romance, but it was solid with respect. And respect, in Sparta, meant more than flowers or poetry. It meant survival. It meant strength. It meant that when Leonidas left for Thermopylae, he carried more than the weight of his shield. He carried her words, her faith, her command. And those words outlived his body, outlived her own life, and still ring in our ears today. Because their marriage wasn't just about love or duty. It was about a shared philosophy that honor mattered more than life, that Sparta mattered more than both of them. And in that, Gorgo and Leonidas were the perfect Spartan pair. Leonidas fell at Thermopylae, but Gorgo did not fade with him. Many queens in the ancient world disappeared after their husbands' deaths, slipping quietly into mourning, remembered only as widows or footnotes. But not Gorgo. If Leonidas became a martyr of the battlefield, Gorgo became the living memory of Sparta's resilience. She was more than a queen who once whispered to a king. She was a voice that refused to go silent, a presence that reminded her people why they fought in the first place. Her son, Pleistarchus, was still a boy when Leonidas died, a minor, not ready to rule, not ready to carry the heavy weight of Sparta's crown. In other places, this might have meant chaos, opportunists clawing at the throne. But in Sparta, there was Gorgo, mother, advisor, strategist. Officially, the Council of Elders and Regents guided the boy. Unofficially, Gorgo's voice carried as much weight as any general's spear. She didn't take the throne, but she didn't need to. Her influence reached where titles couldn't. There's a story of a message, an unassuming wooden tablet covered in wax, its surface blank. Men looked at it, puzzled, muttering, debating. What could it mean? How could a blank board carry anything useful? But Gorgo saw deeper. She told them to scrape off the wax. Beneath it, etched into the wood itself, was the truth, a hidden warning about the Persians. That moment wasn't just a clever trick, it was a revelation of how her mind worked. Where others stopped at the surface, she cut deeper. She saved lives not with a shield, but with insight. This was Gorgo's gift. She didn't need to march into battle to defend her people. She could guard them with words, with counsel, with wit sharp enough to slice through any fog of deception. She had grown up at the edge of politics, watching her father's rise and fall, learning early that bribes and corruption could rot a kingdom from within. She knew the danger wasn't always an enemy army at the gates. Sometimes it was gold slipping into the wrong hands, whispers traded in dark corners, and she called it out without fear. Her words became weapons, as feared as any sword. When an Athenian woman mocked Spartan wives, wondering why they seemed to rule their husbands, Gorgo's retort was instant and unforgettable. Because we are the only women who give birth to men. That wasn't just pride. That was Sparta's creed, voiced by a queen who understood that women were the backbone of the city. They bore warriors. They raised them. They demanded from them the same steel they carried themselves. Even historians, usually so quick to erase women's names, couldn't ignore Gorgo. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, mentioned her by name more than once, a rarity for women in the ancient world. That alone tells us something. She was too sharp, too bold, too important to leave out. Her story survived not because someone wanted to tell tales of queens, but because she forced history to remember her. As the years passed, Gorgo didn't soften. Sparta itself didn't soften. While Athens chased philosophy and art, while other cities bent and changed, Sparta remained rigid, disciplined, proud to the point of danger. Gorgo saw all of it. The rise of Athens, the rivalries that would tear Greece apart, the looming storm of the Peloponnesian War. She knew that Sparta's greatest strength, its unbending discipline, was also its greatest weakness. And yet, she never wavered in her pride. For her honor mattered more than adaptation, dignity more than compromise. It's tempting to imagine her in those later years, standing in the shadows of the council chamber, her son seated among the elders, her voice cutting in when needed. Not shouting, not demanding, but advising, guiding, steadying. A mother, yes. A queen, yes. But also something more, a strategist who knew when to speak, and when silence itself was a weapon. Her legacy wasn't carved in marble. No statues stood in her honor. No temples bore her name. But her words survived, sharper and clearer than any monument. Come back with your shield or on it. Because we are the only women who give birth to men. Father, you had better leave, or this stranger will corrupt you. Each one a spear thrown across time, still striking, still piercing. In a world where women were often silenced, Gorgo's voice was remembered. In a city where men were forged in fire, she showed that steel could exist in words as well as in shields. She raised a king, counseled a council, warned of corruption, and lived with the same relentless dignity that defined her people. Her story reminds us that resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman in the corner of a council chamber, solving the riddle no one else can. Sometimes it's a mother holding a city together with steady hands while others mourn. Sometimes it's words whispered to a husband before he marches to his death, words that become legend. Gorgo's resilience wasn't about bending the world to her will. It was about standing unbent in a world that tried to overlook her. And that, in the end, is her greatest legacy. Not just queen, not just widow, not just mother, but Spartan.